Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us tonight Mr. Eric Link. And the drum roll and clapping. There's the clapping. All right, cool. All right, Eric. Thanks for coming on. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Who is Eric? What do you like to do in your free time? All that kind of good stuff.
So professionally, I'm a musician. I finished my doctorate in music just about a year and a half ago, and professionally, I work as a private lesson teacher and freelance classical musician in eastern and central Nebraska.
Okay, and what instruments do you specialize in?
Mainly French horn is my primary instrument, or horn as the professional players would prefer it be called. And then brass instruments in general are my specialty when it comes to like teaching instruments.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess we'll just dive right into questions about your works then. So do you include music in your writing and because you have such a fondness for it?
There's a song in this first book, the book Dreams of the Witches 3, and as I'm writing the sequel book at the moment, I am trying to add more songs and lyrics and things like that into the books. I haven't written any sheet music or anything like that for them yet, but I've been toying with the idea of trying to write some sheet music and include it, in the stories and things like that, just to, help flesh out the world a little bit and give people a chance to actually perform music from that world as I hear it, and they get to actually hear it with me then by performing it
Yeah,
themselves.
no, absolutely. I think scores, and obviously like this goes along a little bit better with like movies, for example, because you don't always have like a score when you're reading a book.
Right.
But like they bring such a strong sense of belonging in some cases and epicness in some other cases. So if you could create that for your own stories like that, I feel like that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I feel like some of my own favorite scores come from like Lord of the Rings. The Charge of the Rohirrim, I always like cry a little bit. And then like I love Halo, the Halo video game scores. Like scores are definitely a very powerful elicitor of emotion.
Yeah, one of the things I listen to music a lot while I'm writing, and for this book, one of the main things I was listening to was the score, the soundtrack from the 1980 something or other Conan the Barbarian movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is just a fantastic fantasy movie in my opinion. And that soundtrack is one of the best ever written. So that just it hits the mood.
I can't see I've ever. Yeah, I've never watched it, and I've definitely never heard the score. I've seen him, in his little outfit, the lamentations of your women and all that stuff. Right. But other than that,
it's just such a wonderful, over-the-top example of sword and sorcery fantasy as a genre, where everything's just dialed up to 11, be it silly or not, and it's just wonderful because of it.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, sword and sorcery fantasy. Now, that's what you've written in your book, Dream of Witches 3. And you also sent me a little blurb where you said that you do competitive sword fighting as a hobby. It looks like you're wearing mail right now. So that's kind of cool. Yep. How'd you get into that?
I was born into it.
In the mail or into the sword fighting?
Well, a little bit of both, I guess. But yeah, I was raised in a medieval recreation group called the SCA, or Society for Creative Anachronism, and my parents had been involved in the group since the 1970s, back in the old days. My mom does a lot of the more music and arts type elements, or period music and things like that are studied in the SCA, and my dad has been studying the sword fighting for a long time. And as I hit, my adolescence and teenage years, I started getting more into actually learning how to do this and started actually doing it competitively, and still do that as a hobby to this day.
Okay, that's cool. So, armor was obviously created to protect the wearer. And in movies, you see people, take like a quick shank on their side wearing full plate mail, and then they fall over dead. Obviously, I don't think that's necessarily realistic, but I've never done it, like competed in this the way you have. But how protective would you say armor actually is in a real fight with a sword?
Fairly protective. In the case of the SCA, our weapons are made out of rattan, so it's kind of like bamboo but not hollow. And we're doing full contact. We are striking fairly hard when we're hitting each other, And like this mail, I don't tend to wear a whole lot of extra body armor under the mail, other than what's required by SCA safety rules. And one of the things that advantages mail has is you can wear it very loose, and then a club type weapon like up in the armpit, it's hanging loose, and the rattan sword that the SCA uses, it has to move all this armor before it even gets to me. And so it's fairly absorbing of like impact damage and things like that. And this is just fairly light. This is the kind of stuff, say, Vikings would have worn. Full plate armor. There's other groups that use blunted steel weapons and do similar full contact type fighting, and it works fairly well. The armor does eventually get damaged and destroyed after repeated impacts. And it gets broken and people have to then fix it, etc. But you're definitely not just sticking a little stiletto knife through somebody's breastplate if it's properly made and just that's it, fight's over.
Yeah. What's the chance of sustaining an injury in your sport, and have you ever been injured?
I have avoided actual like real injuries so far. Minor bruising and stuff like that. Because we are, like I said, hitting each other. Most of the injuries I've seen that are actually injuries in the SCA are from just mostly armor bites, where the armor itself is what actually kind of pinches you in some way. It is a contact sport, so every once in a while somebody does have something with their knee or something like that happens, but it's generally a fairly safe combat sport, all things considered.
Used to be an adventurer like yourself before I took an arrow to the knee. Cool. So you mentioned obviously it's a sword and sorcery fantasy. So how did you include the sword fighting in your books, and did you make it as realistic as possible, or do you still put some flair in there just to keep things interesting?
I put some flair into it, and one of the other things I did was I tried to make it realistic, but not to a technical degree that's going to bore people. Because I could write a fight scene that goes on and on about the exact relative positions and the angles where you're standing relative to your opponent and what lines you can then attack your enemy on. And then I could write this extensively detailed fight scene that nobody who's basically, if you don't already have the knowledge of fighting with a sword that like I have or other people who seriously study Western martial arts, have, the fight would just get tedious and boring to read. So I put snippets of that kind of information in there, but the rest of it I tried to just keep it as flowing and moving as possible. So that way it doesn't get boring and doesn't feel like just a technical manual on how to fight with a sword.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like that's a struggle that a lot of authors that have a lot of knowledge in their area of expertise run into, where they're like, well, it has to be exactly realistic, and I'm going to explain how it's realistic and why it's realistic. But we're just like, I just want to see someone get hit in the face.
Right. And so I was focused on more of the dance and the flow of the fight when I was doing a lot of the writing of the fight scenes, with moments of being very specific, so that if you could get an impressionistic sort of picture of what is happening at any given moment, was sort of my goal, as opposed to, well, he put his left toe over here by 2 inches and then he dropped his hand out to try to fake this way and then he steps around the other side. There's a little bit of that, but if every line of a fight scene is that, I'm really of the opinion it's just going to get really tedious.
Yeah.
Another example of an author who came out of the SCA and wrote sword and sorcery fantasy books is Paul Edwin Zimmer, and his writing in the series The Dark Border is an example of another person who did a pretty good job of just describing in very impressionistic, more general terms these kinds of fights. But if you know something about sword fighting, you can still get a very clear picture of what he's describing on a technical level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you briefly touched on this, which leads me to a question, which is tactics versus brute force. So in what case would someone who is a much better sword fighter be able to beat someone who's just bigger and stronger? Is that really like tactics are everything, or is it like a combination of the two?
Tactics are going to have to be the dominant factor in fighting, and that was one of the things I was trying to do when writing the main character, because the main character is of supernatural origins, so he is inhumanly strong, and that's established pretty early, at least his strength is, and then exactly why he's that strong, is explained a few chapters in. But he was also born and raised for fighting with swords and being a warrior, and so he spent his whole life being trained in almost nothing but fighting. And so he's got the tactics and the understanding of everything else that gives him a further advantage in combat. Because the whole point of like a martial art in general is being able to deal with somebody who's bigger and stronger than you are and help neutralize that. Because within the confines of the SCA, we do have some safety rules that mitigate how much of a strength advantage people have, how much that strength advantage is effective. But people who are bigger and stronger than I am can kind of move me around and stuff like that, even in the SCA fighting. But so tactics that I use mainly where I stand relative to my opponent and trying to just never be in places where they can actually apply their weight or their strength directly to me helps neutralize that and level the playing field more where I can use my strengths better to my advantage.
Mm-hmm. You sent me a YouTube video, which is pretty cool. I'll link that in the description below of you fighting. It looked like it was mostly one-on-one combat, but have you ever been involved in like a battle or a skirmish with multiple other individuals?
Yep, absolutely. I have. The SCA does a lot of that. There's actually a massive event out in the Cooper's Lake campground in Pennsylvania called Penzic War that has hundreds of fighters on a side typically at the battles at Penzic. And it's one of the largest recreation groups events that happens in the world every year in the summers. And those battles can get kind of interesting with because the tactics change a little bit because some of the stuff I talked about with movement and positioning get a lot more convoluted when you have allies on either side of you.
Yeah.
And it becomes more about the lines and the formations and stuff like that, as opposed to the individual single combat. And also having to keep an eye on, when you're engaged in two lines, you're not just looking at the guy in front of you, you're keeping an eye on the guy with a spear who's about 10 feet or so to your right and making sure he can't put a thrust right on your faceplate. Because we do wear full encased helms. There's steel helms as well with padding and stuff on the inside, so that he can stab directly at my face.
Oh wow.
It's
That's
not going to
cool.
get to the flesh assuming my helm is working properly, but
yeah. It's interesting. Like I'm by no means an expert in medieval warfare or anything like that, but I've done a little bit of research. And in movies they always have like tens of thousands of men charging at each other, ready to just die for their country and bleed all over the place. And like it doesn't seem like that was really what happened. It's most people just wanted to preserve themselves and not die. So you kind of just had people kind of poking each other with swords and shields and kind of staying back. Is that kind of what you get during your skirmishes, or because there's no threat, do you kind of just go ham? Like, walk me through that.
It's a mix of both, and it also partially depends on the scenarios we're doing for those battles. So sometimes we're doing scenarios where it's more based on time limit and who occupies a certain kind of level of ground. Like we do mock bridge battles, and it's mostly about which side controls what percentage of the bridge at the end of the time limit. And then in those bridge battles, we usually do like you get killed, you have to go walk back to some sort of like resurrection, respawn point, and then walk your way back over to the actual battle. Other battles will do full-blown field battles, and that tends to be more you're just dead and you're done until that field battle's over. And so that'll change your behavior a little bit. So sometimes it can get very, just kind of poking at each other. And it also depends on your energy level, because usually you're walking around in the sun, and a lot of these big war type events are in the summers. And so it's, 80, 90 degrees out, and you're wearing the full armor. Yeah. And so early in the day, we might be a little more just kind of rushing in, but then later on, we're just tired. And so you can get a lot more just standing around poking at each other with spears, because it just takes too much energy to just do a full-size column charge or something into the other side.
Yeah, that brings a little bit more realism to it, I guess, than some people might expect. I played rugby for many years, and so it's not the same thing as you, but I've been on a battlefield, so to speak, quote unquote, and you get exhausted, you get the adrenaline rushes of running into people and tackling them. Do you get that adrenaline buzz too?
Yeah, a little bit. It just that, okay, we're moving, and wham, and you got to hit and you got to go and try to keep moving forward as much as possible. Because if you're not moving forward, there's probably somebody hitting you in the head.
Yeah. Okay, so sword and sorcery, again, back to that. Do you practice magic as well in real life?
No, not so much.
Not so much. Oh, okay. Dang, I was gonna have
No.
you spill all the secrets to me.
Gotcha.
So walk me through your magic system then, and then we'll get into world building a little bit.
Okay, so the magic system is mostly based on it's more of a soft system. Um, it's based on, any individual has a certain amount of energy or power that they can use to cast spells, and then after that, you need to start looking for alternative power sources. Be it through some sort of violent sacrifice or some other method, you need to come up with other ways to power the spells you are then casting. There are also items that sorcerers can use to enhance their power or kind of sort of preload a spell. So that way, when they actually get into a sticky situation, they don't need to use any of like their energy they have right now. They can just use the item that they've already basically used to store a spell in, and then just cast it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I've limited that, so that's usually only like the most powerful of the sorcerers can actually make these items. Lesser sorcerers really, they just don't have the ability to do that. So that helps limit that from just being some guy, every other sorcerer has just got a box full of explosive things that can just blow a whole town into oblivion at the blink of an eye. So you have to do limiting factors like that.
Okay. So you mentioned like a limit on the amount of spells they could cast. Now is that like and then after that you mentioned sacrificing or something like that. So is that limit a lifetime limit, and then once they hit their capacity they have to sacrifice, or is it like they recharge over time?
It's sort of like recharge over time. Like, okay, I'm worn out. I need to go eat something and get some sleep, and I'll be ready to go again in a day or two, kind of thing.
Okay. And are the spells that you've incorporated into your books, are they like if you can do magic, you can do anything your mind can desire, or is it like you have a fireball and like an earth spike and like a wind wall? Like walk me through that a little bit.
Kind of more in the almost anything that you can desire, you can do if you have the power to do it.
Okay.
It's pretty much how that goes. And the titular witches, are exceptionally powerful, magic users in the story, and they get up to some very interesting and dangerous things. And part of the plot hinges on their usage of a very volatile power source. I don't want to give away too much because a lot of this is about finding out as you read what's going on with these characters.
Okay.
And
cool.
Also learning more about the magic system as you go through the story.
Yeah. I'm not going to force you to spoil your entire book now. Just a couple questions to prod a little bit.
Yeah, no, I got it. Just sweating around being so cagey.
So you mentioned in your book blurb that gods came and destroyed their world. So why, unless there's too many spoilers, but why and how did that happen? And what is the state of the world when the reader comes into it?
Okay, so the state of the world element is that most of the world is fine. The area that was destroyed was this one particular kingdom that's way up north, and the continent the story takes place in, and the main character is from that northern kingdom. And this race of war gods has not pushed it beyond that up to this point. And he's been and the main character, Radnor, has been wandering around the world for the last 10 years looking for a way to get back at these war gods, and really hasn't had a whole lot of luck trying to get the tools he needs to fight back properly. As for the why they did this, that is definitely in the spoiler territory.
Gotcha. Okay. So you mentioned your main character, he has some sort of innate powers or something like that. What powers are these? Do they increase his magic? Are they strength abilities? Like, walk me through those powers a little bit. Maybe where they came from, if it's not too much of a spoiler.
Where they came from is a little bit of a spoiler. It's explained relatively early, but it's still far enough in where I want the reader to be able to be asking for the first few chapters what's going on. Well, why is he so strong? And it's mainly, in his case, physical strength and a certain resistance to some magic, but not like, oh, he's completely invulnerable like Superman kind of. It's just some things like spells that would affect his mind don't work on him to the degree that it would on a normal human. But predominantly it's he heals relatively quickly, though not Wolverine levels. It's not He's not going to take an arrow to the shoulder, pull it out, and be fine 3 seconds later. That wound is going to stay around for a while. But instead of being debilitated for a month, he's going to be debilitated for a couple of days from that wound. But otherwise, he's just extremely superhumanly strong is the main way his power manifests.
Okay, got it. On to world building a little bit more. You mentioned a continent or a world or something like that. So I'm assuming it doesn't take place in Earth, so to speak, but it is an Earth-like environment.
Correct.
Okay.
Predominantly, the part of the world that the first book takes place in, this continent, most of actually even then, the book pretty much takes place all in the northern half of this continent, which is pretty much modeled on standard cold climate, Western European kind of environment.
Okay.
And one of the things I've explored a little more going into book 2 is some of the island chains that I have set up on the south of this continent, and they're more inspired, more North Africa to Middle East kind of inspired cultures and environment.
Okay. Now, do the inhabitants of these different regions have different magics, different outlook on magic? Like, walk me through kind of the culture or things like that in your world.
So the first book doesn't get into it a ton in terms of other cultures because it's very focused on the specific region of the North World, which is that northern half of the continent, and the characters refer to it as the North World. And though that culture is predominantly modeled on Anglo-Saxon or inspired by Anglo-Saxon, right around the time in real history, right around the time the Great Heathen Army came and conquered the good chunk of England. And so if you've seen like the TV show The Last Kingdom on Netflix, kind of that Anglo-Saxon sort of culture that also inspired the Last Kingdom show is kind of what I was going for, that same root sort of culture. And with regards to your question about the magic systems, it's not so they don't so much look at magic differently. They all have slightly different variants on the gods they worship, and how their worship is a little different than the reality of the gods as they are or were.
Interesting.
And there's and I don't get to do it much in book 1. I touch on it a little bit because the main god of Radnor's homeland, is a different god than the one who's the main god of the people he's mostly around in book 1. But then in book 2, there's going to be more nuances as I show more of the different kinds of people that are in this world.
Can you, without spoilers, get into your pantheon a little bit?
Unfortunately, not really, because the central plot of what will be the series as I keep writing the books, which I'm looking at about 5 books currently, is what it'll take to do the actual story correctly, hinges very heavily on this pantheon and what the things that they have done and are doing and will do, and their relationship to the more mortal characters in this world.
Okay. Before I have you read an excerpt, which you still want to read an excerpt?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So last question before that then would be if you could sell your book to someone in just a few sentences, like why my book or my story is so unique compared to everything else out there, and make them buy it from you, what would you say to them?
It's an exciting story with a lot of action scenes written by someone who really knows how to fight with swords, and that is reflected in the way it's written. There's a lot of mystery and political intrigue going on, and how all the different plots relate to each other and have a major purpose. And I think every character has something that almost anyone reading it can identify with, even the villains.
Awesome. Cool. I like it. Yeah, go ahead and read your excerpt now.
Okay, so I'm going to have a little thing to remind me which pages things are on. So
take your time.
We're talking about writing the sword sequences. There is a scene where Radnor is engaged in combat against a demonic enemy fairly early in the book. And Radnor is having to deal with this thing, and it's as big and strong as he is in this case. So one of the things I had to figure out was I've established this guy is so strong that no normal mortal person could ever stand up to him between his strength and his training. So I had to come up with a lot of different enemies that are a match for him in one way or another. And in this case, it's this demonic enemy that is bigger and stronger than he is. So this is in the middle of an extended fight scene. There was a pause in the assault. Radnor had a moment to grab one of the candles lighting the room and began to set the tapestries in the sanctuary ablaze. He intended to retreat through the back window using the smoke and fire for cover, but his plan was interrupted when a massive demon managed to break down the reinforced door to the temple. The creature stood easily a foot taller than Radnor and was the most man-like of the demons that had so far appeared. It was covered in armor made from the bones of other demons it had killed. The beast carried an axe in one hand and a shield in the other. Radnor swiftly engaged in his bloody profession. He immediately stepped towards the monster and positioned himself so that it had to respond to the threat his movement posed. Predictably, for a demon, the monster swung its axe at his head. Radnor ducked the fearsome blow and reversed direction to step under the monster's arm. Throwing a tight, close-range blow, Radnor drove his blade into the monster's armor, but the bones were thick and the sword merely cut a groove in them. Radnor followed up his sword blow with a strike from his shield to the same spot. Cracks streaked across the demon's armor, but it still did not break. The demon turned to face Radnor again and brought its shield to bear, striking at Radnor's sword shoulder. Radnor twisted away from the blow, but the shield still grazed his arm. Ordinarily, the pain would not have slowed Radnor down at all, but with the open wound on his shoulder, the pain was so severe Radnor dropped his sword. Confidence filled the demon's heart, and it swung another heavy blow down at the annoying human. Radnor was able to turn his center-gripped shield in his hand and keep the face of it between him and the demon's axe. The blow slid along the face of the shield and away from Radnor's body. Radnor backed away from the demon and waited for a follow-up blow. None came. Radnor peered out from behind the shield to find the monster was waiting for him to come back for his sword, which it now guarded. Radnor saw more demons start to come through the door, but the big one waved them back. It wanted this kill for himself. Radnor saw only one weapon he could get to, as his spear lay on the floor at the other end of the hall. Radnor stepped towards the demon, but did not make a move towards his own sword. The overconfident monster swung a blow straight down at Radnor, intending to split him from head to groin. Radnor timed the blow perfectly. He simultaneously stepped aside and deflected the blow with his shield. Off balance, the demon took a split second too long to realize what was happening. Radnor smashed his shield into the exposed elbow joint of the demon's arm. The monster howled in pain, and its grip on its axe loosened enough for Radnor to pry the weapon from its hands. He rolled the axe into an arcing slash and drove it into the beast's exposed elbow, slicing the arm to the bone. The demon let out an agonized howl and frantically swiped at Radnor with its shield. Radnor stepped around the incoming blow and found himself behind the demon. Radnor drove the axe blade as hard as he could into the unarmored back of its leg, and the beast crumpled in a heap on the floor. Dropping the axe, Radnor scooped his sword back up and finished the crippled monster with a thrust through its eye while it still lay on the ground. So that was one of the more technical fights. Most of the time it's a little less like that, and I describe more of the flowing motions that he's moving as he's usually cutting down more than one enemy in a single fight. But that was one where it's like, okay, there's one guy right in front of him that's as strong as he is and is really dangerous. How is he going to deal with it? And that's where the tactics that we were talking about earlier start to come in.
Awesome. Yeah, well, before I give you a comment, you deserve a round of applause. So, all right, that was enough. Not too much. It's going to go to your head. So I did like that scene, and I can see how you were very descriptive in actually like planning out their movements around each other, and it seemed like a dance and seeing how they could poke and prod, and it wasn't just like he came and chopped his head off and he was done. Like I could see how you planned the whole scene, so I really do appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any final comments before I let you
go? Nothing is leaping to mind other than this story is a ton of fun to write. I'm currently working on book 2, and it's been a lot of fun writing that one as well.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'll put some links to your works in the description, and everybody, Eric Linke.